All right. Welcome everyone to our final workshop in International Survey Methods of the fall semester. Thank you so much for being here. We're closing out the semester with Dr. Shana Warren, Director at Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA. And today she will share insights on representativeness across four remote survey modes in 9 low and middle income countries. Shana, we're delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thanks everyone for coming. It was probably an increasingly busy time in the semester. I wanted to greet you with my smiling face, but I am not going to leave that over the slides for the entire setup. I just thought it was a sort of nice beginning point. So good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're all located. Good morning, I guess, Central Time, and further the West. So my name is Shana Warren. I'm the Associate Director of Path to Scale Research at IPA. I also have worked on sort of a range of other projects during the pandemic. I joined IPA like 8 weeks before the pandemic, so it very much changed how things went. This is work that was a collaboration with a long list of co-authors from below, and also part of a collaborative effort between IPA researchers and the generous researchers outside IPA who shared their data and really a lot of collaborative effort into understanding their data. There we go. So why are remote surveys suddenly of much more interest in low and middle income countries? And I will say in particular in lower income countries. So first, the rising mobile coverage and internet access across these regions. Remote surveys have more or less become more feasible and less expensive. It really depends a bit on the context. Alongside that, many more individuals have phones in low and middle income countries, although related to a bunch of other work that I've done, I would put a lot of caution on who owns phones, who even within the household owns phones. It is much easier to reach, for example, heads of household than other individuals in the household, in particular, the lower status within the household, the less likely someone might be to have a phone. Response rates, on the other hand, are often much higher than in OECD polls, just in general, but coverage is fairly unevenly distributed. So yes, a high percent of the population is covered in most countries, but there are large areas that are systematically excluded from almost all remote surveys. And that is important to keep in mind that no amount of weighting will address that the most rural areas are not in your sample. There's no weight you can put on something that isn't there at all. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic raised this new interest in remote and rapid survey methods. Okay. But there were a lot of budgetary decisions driving really ad hoc choices without really thinking hard about the mode effects. And response rates, we do know, vary by mode. So our big question is here, can remote surveys estimate national statistics to inform policy? There. All right. So how do you go about selecting this? Put out a second. So how do we go about selecting survey modes in low and middle income countries? Well, there's kind of a stark trade-off, right, between cost, coverage, and response bias. So first, as I mentioned ahead of time, which respondents can even be reached with a given method? It's not so binary as who has a phone or who does not have a phone, but rather who has access to a phone at a given point in the day. For example, if I'm a farmer and I work out in the fields all day, I might not have access to my phone until the evenings. And if you only make survey calls during the business day, you might never reach me, okay? Even if I have a phone. Or I might switch it off. Or I might journey between coverage areas and non-coverage areas during the course of the day. And then among reachable respondents, of course, which ones actually will respond, who picks up the phone for an unfamiliar number, who chooses to respond to a survey, and then how many respondents can you reach with a given budget and deadline? That's sort of the realistic point. And a lot of this trade-off is going to depend on how accurate we need the estimates to be. Do you need it quickly? Do you need it representative? Do you think that there's variation, importantly, between covered and non-covered respondents along the lines of your main outcome variables? Okay. So how did we go through this? So we asked two critical questions. How representative are remotely recruited samples in the first place? And then second of all, how much can we use ex post adjustment, i.e. weighting, to address any challenges we see in the representativeness of our data? So how did we approach this? So big picture, you could do a side-by-side comparison. It's a bit tough to sell that. So we compare remote survey samples to a recent quote unquote benchmark. These benchmarks are our best estimate of what the ground truth is, because to estimate how far off your survey sample is, you need a ground truth. And this is a big piece of the challenge in many low and middle income countries, is that ground truth data, so nationally representative household surveys, are not taken terribly often. So for example, the Living Standards Measurement Study surveys, the LSMS, run supported by the World Bank in a large number of countries, is certainly not run every year. Right? So we compare the remote survey samples to the most recent benchmark we have for the ground truth. And then we focus on variables that are asked similarly across several surveys. An extensive piece of the effort in this project was around harmonizing microdata from surveys that were never designed to go together. So we take advantage of instances in which multiple survey projects were conducted at around the same time. All of these are between 2020 and like the first quarter of 2023. The same time in the same country to better understand timing, composition, mode, and how these impact our results. So specifically what's here in the unique opportunity created by the pandemic, unique research opportunity, I would say. There are 4 different projects that we look at. The Afrobarometer, which is a public opinion survey asked every few years across most, but certainly not all, sub-Saharan African countries. We use a social media project that was via Facebook. We used IPA's own, we called it Recover surveys, rapid COVID response surveys. Those were conducted via RDD. And then we used Living Standards Measurement surveys. They ran a high frequency panel survey. I'll get into that more in a minute, using a set of respondents for whom they'd already collected phone numbers. These were conducted in 9 countries. Notably, Mexico is just Mexico City, but everywhere else, these were national studies. So when we do the comparisons in Mexico, we have taken the national data and only used the same area around Mexico City, which is uniquely applicable to Mexico because they recently had redone their phone numbering system so that it was possible to target just Mexico City. That's not typically possible with cell phone numbers. I'm sure most of us have a cell phone number that begins with a code that does not represent where we currently are if we're within the US. It's just where you were living when you first got a phone. Also, feel free to jump in with questions. I don't mind being interrupted if there's something that comes up along the way. So these studies used 4 different sampling frames. So a sample, either the frame was all private households within the country, within some constraints of safety and security, all active phone numbers, specifically mobile phone numbers. There are very few landlines in most low and middle income countries, and typically they have different area codes, making it possible to select for just mobile phones. The LSMS respondents in a previous round of fully in-person work who had a phone and phone number that they shared, the Facebook active user base. So these are 4 different sampling frames. There were 3 different interview modes. They could have been face-to-face, phone, or online self-administered. That came through Facebook. And the recruitment methods could have been a household and in-person at base, a pure RDD approach, and online through social media. So there's a wide range here. we really want to know by how much do estimates vary across these. This is sort of summarizing. Here are, in the top row, you see the official national surveys where we used LSMS studies. These were all in-person recruitment and interviews sampling from the full sample of private households subject to safety and security. We had that data in all 9 countries. Among Afrobarometer surveys run during the period in question, these were again in-person interviews. Afrobarometer did not opt for remote methods, so this is in-person at the time of the pandemic. The RDD surveys were active mobile phone numbers. Everything is done by phone. We have this for 9 countries. The high frequency panel survey is LSMS respondents who had phones, as I mentioned before, and then we have the Facebook social media survey. We typically refer to it just as social media throughout the rest of the presentation. Okay. So here's challenge number 1 in this exercise. These are the national benchmark surveys we had available to us. Notice that our surveys were conducted between 2020 and early 2023. But in Burkina Faso, for example, the most recent nationally representative survey was in 2014. So we recognize that some of this data is very outdated. That's sort of the most extreme case. Only Colombia, Nigeria, Mexico City, and Sierra Leone were within a year or 2 of the start of the pandemic. So this is just a limitation to the design. So we use these because ground truth data is never really available. That's why we're running surveys. If we knew, we wouldn't spend our time this way. And all modes are mediated by the instruments, by the protocols. So we took the best available data here. In terms of weighting, we used a range of variables, somewhat depending on what was available in the data set: age group, education, urbanicity, which was defined as the 2nd level regions containing cities with more than, with a population greater than 300,000, and gender. So quickly through our empirical strategy. So we wanted to know how representative remotely recruited samples were. So for any given target variable Y, at the individual level, we are estimating it within a country, within a specific survey sample. And we want to know when and how much does ex post adjustment reduce the beta CS. So the estimate on any given variable for whatever our target might have been. I won't spend too long on here. It's nicer to see the results. So this is a largely visual discussion of results. So, apologies. Oh, that's very strange. What has happened? All right. Let's see if that takes us through. Okay, good. So respondent gender is the first one that I want to address. And for this slide, I'm going to begin by explaining what you're looking at. So here we have grouped together all the RDD surveys, all the LSMS call list, that is the high frequency panel surveys that were implemented during the pandemic, calling phone numbers from the LSMS, social media surveys, and face-to-face surveys. The estimates, the 0 dotted line here, is the average benchmark sample mean in the benchmark, typically LSMS type of study, okay? And what we are looking for is how many percentage points off we are. So 0.05, you're 5 percentage points off from where we would like to be to have a representative sample. Weights are normalized to sum to 1 within each sample. The gray boxes shown, for example, here and here, there are several of them for each row. So if you look across the RDD row, you see there's a gray box at 5 percentage points below the benchmark mean. So that is our unweighted sample. Okay, and you can see these for each one. There is a gray unweighted and a box and a solid weighted diamond. These are the mean values and confidence intervals for the benchmark data. In this case, the share of all adults reached by a nationally representative survey who are female or reside in urban areas in the country, etc. So what do we see? First, the RDD and social media studies significantly oversample men in every African sample. Weighting is able to adjust for this somewhat in the RDD surveys, but not very well in the social media surveys. You can see that we've moved a fair distance closer to zero. So all of the weights, we're trying to get closer to the actual estimate centered at zero. We don't make much progress at all in the face-to-face surveys, which we're not too far off. The LSMS surveys, so the face-to-face is Afrobarometer. The LSMS surveys, these are call lists from something that started out nationally representative, which means that they had a better weighting vector in the first place and a more representative sample to begin with. Afrobarometer is a smaller national sample than a typical LSMS survey. We see RDD when we put weights in, we're only a little bit closer and we're in the other direction. Taking these to see each individual study from each country in the sample, we can see sort of the full range. We've sort of flipped it around here. We've grouped all the RDD studies on the left, the call lists, then the social media, Facebook study, and then face-to-face. And you see that these gray boxes for RDD and social media start out really far away, and we do kind of all right in the adjustment. We're getting a lot closer to zero. I will stop and note here that one of these surveys, the Afrobarometer, was mechanically designed to be 50-50 male and female, even though most populations are slightly more female than male. So sort of there was some misestimate baked into that face-to-face survey on purpose. Yeah. For education, we harmonized education data using a set of UNESCO measures that classified education as no formal education, having completed basic or primary, intermediate or secondary education, and then this advanced category for higher education. Okay. What do we see? We find that weighting is very effective for the RDD surveys overall. It does very little for the LSMS call list, which was not too far off in the first place. It's wildly ineffective for the social media study. Why might this be? I think we can make a fair assessment that the use of social media and Facebook in particular is not going to be a representative sample of the population. Okay. So the social media sample was just way off on basic levels of education. Here we see it for all of the data individually so that you're not so concerned that everything has been, pooled away and we've lost the bigger picture. We do see that RDD, once weighted, moves things a little, but it almost moves things in it just as likely moves things in the wrong direction as the right one. Social media, again, you cannot place enough weights to get a survey that is representative of something that is not in your sample. And if we had very few people with not even an elementary, a primary education, there's no amount of weighting that can fix that. And you see that in the social media sample. On the flip side, we look at advanced education. We're kind of in the same boat. Given time, I won't spend too long on that. But looking at the details here, you can see that social media, it's the same problem in the opposite direction. We knew this to begin with. The sample is really far off. Face-to-face samples are fairly close, as is the call list. Because the call list is generated from in-person nationally representative surveys, it tends to be close in the first place, just like face-to-face surveys. Okay. RDD, we see that weighting was fairly effective in moving from the gray boxes towards the colored ones, indicating that the weighting was fairly effective for these surveys. Okay. We then look at age. Here we binned age into 3 categories. Some surveys had continuous ages and some had bins, so we just binned everyone to make it comparable. So we have an 18 to 34, a 35 to 54, and then a 55 plus category. As is not terribly surprising to most of us, we see that there is a great deal of underrepresentation of the oldest users. This is not a story of Facebook in the United States, which tends to be disproportionately the 50 plus crowd these days, but a question of who owns phones and social media at all. And in sub-Saharan Africa and in many low and middle income countries, Facebook is less popular among older users. So we do weight and we move things closer, but again, you need something to lean on to weight. Okay. Moving on to urbanicity, our percent living in urban areas. Unsurprisingly, the one that really stands out here is that social media is way, way far out here. Okay. The benchmark mean is 0.36. We are up at like 0.66. This is a huge overrepresentation of urban areas, but also not very surprising, okay, in the context in which we're looking. Weighting is not able to address it when you don't have anything to lean on. RDD, we got closer. LSMS call list, we get closer. Face-to-face was fairly close in the first place. And you see that in detail looking at each individual survey. I think of these as the gray dots being yanked back towards the zero, the benchmark, as close as they can. But before I go on to this, there is a very different story when it is time to think about pre-pandemic employment. So all the variables we've looked at so far are ones that we are able to weight for. Like we can use weighting in all of these surveys: age, education, gender, urbanicity. These are captured in the weights. But pre-pandemic employment is not. So we used pre-pandemic employment, and it was difficult to harmonize. I would say these are imperfect measures of employment because we know that the pandemic itself was a shock to employment. So asking somebody if they were employed in 2021 and then trying to use a benchmark from 2017 of national level employment is not terribly informative. So we're looking specifically at pre-pandemic employment, first of all. We define that as having been engaged in any remunerative activity, including formal employment, wage labor, agriculture, either for sale or for yourself, or self-employment. Also, these response windows vary a lot across questionnaires. So this is the grain of salt as we head into pre-pandemic employment. Okay. So each of these surveys, we notice that the weights have very limited impact on the estimates, right? The confidence intervals grow, as is always the case with weighting. The confidence intervals are larger, but we are not able to go back to the benchmark mean any closer than we were in the unweighted sample for these. If we look at the full picture of all of the studies, I think this is the most clear. Unfortunately, we do not have this data in the Facebook surveys. I can imagine what this might look like. It's a guess on my end, but it was not asked in the Facebook cross-national pandemic era survey. Okay. So what do we learn from this exercise? All of us went in during the pandemic very excited to really leverage remote surveys. Oh, there's so much more phone ownership in low and middle income countries. There's been a huge leap forward in low income countries, even relative to 10 years earlier. But what have we found across survey modes? Very big picture. Obviously, it's not exactly the case in every country every time, but face-to-face surveys are consistently close to national benchmarks. And the World Bank High Frequency Panel Survey is often just close behind. Remember, this survey is over the phone, but drawing from a sample that was recruited through an in-person nationally representative, enumeration area, very careful process. And these are larger samples. So these are sort of close behind. RDD, random digit dialing, and Facebook platform surveys are consistently biased, as we all anticipated, with respect to age, gender, educational attainment, and urbanicity. Pre-pandemic employment is the only variable we were able to look at consistently across surveys that was not in our weighting vectors. And we note that it's still really hard to predict how a given survey will do ex ante. So we're using pre-pandemic employment as representative of a class of outcome measures for which we're not entirely certain for which we don't have the weighting vector, the weighting data we would need. And it's less certain there. In other work, we have done work around vaccine acceptance and hesitancy. That is yet greater difficulty because in that sense, we don't have any ground truth. We can't even estimate the correlation between the target outcome variable and our demographic variables to be able to weight appropriately. It might be that weighting makes it worse. It might be that weights are irrelevant and there's no correlation in some contexts between the standard demographic variables and COVID vaccine attitudes, but it was not something known ahead of time. Okay. So overall, what do we do with survey weighting in remote LMIC surveys? So survey weights are certainly valuable, and they do best when adjusting for factors that are well measured. So it's a lot easier to measure educational attainment. It's a lot easier to have a clear and precise measurement than for some other more attitudinal measures or self-reporting events that are older or not quite as precise. Survey weights are also valuable to adjust for factors that are correlated with selection probability in the first place, right? And relevant to the outcome of interest, as I was just discussing. Survey weights are helpful when the factors you adjust for are correlated or proxies for the target variable you really most care about. Adjusting based on a simple demographic profile doesn't typically resolve bias in more complex variables like employment. Finally, so what is our near future of remote surveys and LMICs? So at IPA, we certainly continue to run many remote surveys, but the quality of the sampling frame we're using is really important. How old is it? How was it generated in the first place? When relying, for example, on administrative data with phone numbers, how were those collected in the first place? Of the initial sample they were collected from, what share of people and which people provided that data? So we find it absolutely critical to review unweighted values in your data, but also to do as deep a dive as you can into where the sampling frame came from in the first place. During the pandemic, there were many organizations that started with, we have a frame of phone numbers, we have some phone numbers, but they were not so systematic. When we think about remote surveys and LMICs, the other issue is how important is it that we get a really accurate estimate? Do we need to be within 5 percentage points, 10, 20? What is enough for the relevant policy-making decision, if policy-making is your priority? What is enough for a research study for an academic approach? We found that these are sort of the most critical, and as we move forward at IPA, we have been working increasingly when we do remote surveys to make sure we have as much information as possible and encourage people not to jump to the weighted results, but to also look at the unweighted values to really understand what's in our sampling frame. So I'm going to pause there and stop sharing my screen so that anybody could ask questions or anything else.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shanna. That was a great and interesting presentation. So let's open the floor. You can type your question in the chat, you can speak up. Well, while people are thinking, I'll get us started. Um, I found the result of gender in social media very interesting. In the sense, like in my experience in Latin America, we tend to get the opposite. We tend to get more women than men normally when you're recruiting like on Facebook. So besides maybe, simply frames, mode, is there any other possible explanation? I was thinking maybe it's because of religion, because a lot of these countries are Muslim countries. Just want to hear your thoughts on that, Shannon. Yeah.
So I think some of this is less about religion. You know, most of the countries in our sample are not majority Muslim. Um, then about who owns a phone in a household, has
Mm,
access to it during the day, who has access to charging capacity so that they keep it charged. So many people will charge a phone and switch it off if they're going to be away from anywhere they could charge it all day. So some of this is about who is in a location where they both are able to respond to something with their phone and have enough charge to do so and enough time to do so. So phone sharing is more common. Uh, Charge is an issue. Internet bundles are not yet super inexpensive. So all of these things play into who has a phone and who has access to it. I've done some more recent work on looking at a childhood immunization project in Sierra Leone, where we find that caregivers are not as likely to, the primary caregivers or young children are among the least likely within the household to own a phone. I've also been doing some cross-national work that we're slowly publishing at IPA, country by country as we get through, looking at the use of digital financial services. Now there we're only trying to sample people with phones because that's how you're accessing, mobile money and that sort of thing. But even there are distinct gender differences in ownership, access, and usage. So I think that we are still not all the way there on phones. I will also note an unusual finding with respect to gender in other related work, where we found that during the pandemic, in Colombia in particular, women were very much more likely to pick up the phone and be chatty once
yeah.
they did. They were very happy to take surveys. It is true that I too probably would have responded to more surveys at home during the pandemic than typically. Um, anyway, so those are some quick thoughts on there.
Yeah. I mean, the Colombia result makes total sense. Um, One more question before I move to Gabriela. Um, so do you have like opinions and attitudes across the surveys or not? Because I'm mostly interested in knowing if you guys did any work comparing like democratic and non-democratic countries in terms of some, you know, specific or whatever is available in terms of opinions and attitudes.
So the attitude questions in these surveys were typically surrounding the situation very specific to during the pandemic. Um, they were not typically public opinion surveys around anything other
Hmm.
than vaccination or COVID era, like economic policies. A lot of these surveys were linked to governments trying to figure out what needed to be done and other policymakers. Um, so yeah, there are not as many of those as we'd like. We have a whole separate project looking at attitudes towards vaccines, but I would caution that that was much more politicized in OECD countries uh, than in Latin America, and even less politicized in sub-Saharan Africa on vaccines.
Right. Gabrielle?
Hi. So first off, like thank you so much for doing this work. It's incredibly important for the field, and most people don't have the capacity or resources to do it. So this is like a huge public good. Um, Two questions. One is quick. One's an actual question. The quick one is like, is there a copy of this as a paper that I can cite? And then the second one is about sort of your selection of remote surveys. Most people that I talk to are using survey firms, the whatever comparable version there is to Lucid or MTurk in the countries that they're working. Why did you choose not to include that kind of sample in your research? And do you think the results would be different? I know there's been like a little bit of work on this, but I haven't seen anything as like systematic.
So let me speak a little bit to how our sample selection occurred. So we were looking for surveys that covered, we started out with a way longer list. We thought we'd have so many surveys to compare, but we needed them to be similar time frame, same countries, and nationally representative, and or at least with a purpose of being nationally representative, which many, many projects were not. We also needed to reach out to organizations that generated the data to get them to share the microdata with us. And that also, it's not just a question of willingness, it's also that there's effort and time involved in that, and things were pretty rushed during the pandemic. So we have more surveys in another paper on vaccine acceptance because those questions were asked more universally. We also needed a universal question. You notice that we only looked at pre-pandemic employment as a major outcome variable. It's not because we didn't think other things were interesting. They weren't asked as consistently across countries. So because we were using data that already existed, rather than generating this from the beginning and saying, hey, could everybody ask these 8 questions? We had to sort of live with what was there, is sort of the short answer. But I think that would be really interesting. I would love to see how this looks with like MTurk and similar. I think that social media platform work is really interesting. We did not look at WhatsApp surveys because they are relatively uncommon in sub-Saharan Africa to date, and we knew that that would reach a relatively smaller population share in most countries. We were trying to be as broad as possible in this sort of snapshot look, but I think there is really exciting work to be done. And also in just the 5 years since the pandemic, the rate of phone access and ownership, and in particular smartphone access, has changed so much in many of these countries.
Thank you.
To your question, Gabrielle.
Any other questions? Well, I'll take that as a no. So thank you again, Shanna. It was a wonderful way
Sure.
to close. Oh, yeah. Come on,
All
Steven.
right. I was
Yeah.
looking for my buttons to chime in. Almost missed it. So I just to disclose, I'm actually close colleague of Shana's. So I've been, sort of in part of this work in some way for a while. And I wanted to, first of all, answer the question somebody asked, is the paper available? Yes, it is. I was just looking for the link to post it here. I'll do that in a second because there we go. Nope. Well, give me a second. I'll post it here. So the paper is available, and just to advertise sort of related paper that we did on whether referrals can increase representation of women. There's also a paper, if people are interested in that question, I'll just post the link here. But basically, we tested protocols that would, just rely on men passing the phone to their household members, to typically to spouses, and considering that that's a very highly selected group that either accepts or refuses that request to refer sample members. So we looked at representativeness in terms of who is being referred, not just whether referrals are successful. So these are questions that help us try to go from methods like phone survey methods like RDD to achieving representative samples. But the other thing I wanted to more pose as a question or recommendation that people sort of let us know, we're trying to find out generally like who is doing methods research. One of the problems with studies like this is that they're not as glamorous as like the impact evaluation or the underlying survey that was originally commissioned, upon which we're doing methods experiments or methods methodological exercises like this. So yeah, we're really looking to build our community of methods interested researchers. It's one of the reasons why I think this seminar series is really important. And we have a research methods initiative that is a collaboration with Northwestern University, but our network tends to be, academic economists and those running RCTs. But we're really interested in broadening that out. We've started, um, identifying people more in the APOR network who are more pure survey researchers. But I would encourage any of you to reach out to Shana or to me if you want to get on our mailing list or just be more involved, or particularly to share research that you're doing that complements what Shana presented today. Because if somebody else has done work that looks at MTurk or other data sources that are, low cost, but many of our partners have questions about the data quality and representativeness, we want to learn from you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing the paper, Stephen. I really like the idea of the randomization of the passing the phone. That's super interesting. We're also really interested in this type of experiments here at the CGD and the LAPOP lab. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you guys again here. So with that in mind, yeah, I want to thank Shannon again. Wonderful way to close our fall semester of our workshop. And we are already working on the spring schedule. And as always, I will share the official lineup with the mailing list once it's ready. And guess with that, we can wrap up today's session. Thanks again, everyone, and look forward to see you again in the spring. Have
Thank
a
you so much,
good
Ian.
rest of your
Thank you.
day.
Truly feel free to reach out anytime.
Yeah.
Thank you.